Well, thanks so much for joining us today for the webinar covering conditional logic, the addition to Go Smart. What I've got on the screen, I think you can tell on the left-hand side, I've got that tutorial. I'm not going to, obviously read it word for word. You all could do that obviously on your own, but there is a lot of great information in there. So I'm going to just sort of use it as a backbone. And then on the main screen here, I'm going to show you what your applicants see and what you can be expecting to see based on some of your choices. So basically, conditional logic, I think everyone knows, but let's start with like a basic definition, is just when you want to have the response to one question affect the display of another question. And so you're always going to have two questions at play when you're looking at conditional logic. There's always going to be the primary, which is going to be that question on which the conditional logic depends. And so that might be your first question, what identify with. That would be your primary. And then based on the response to that question, a secondary question might appear. So if we selected children make up most of our audience, then we might see this secondary show up. So our primary is going to be that first question, and the secondary is the question that appears based on the response to that first question. And in Go Smart, and in most programs, hopefully, that you work with, the secondary question is the question in which you're going to build that conditional logic. So you might, first off, be thinking, oh, well, I want the response to my primary question to be the thing that kicks it off. So you might be thinking in your head, so I'm going to add the conditional logic to that first question, but that's not the case. You're going to add the conditional logic settings to your secondary, because within your secondary, you're going to point to your first question. And that way, your secondary will display based on the settings you created versus going the other way, where if you set it up for the primary, it might be looking for the wrong thing. So just remember that your secondary is going to contain your conditional logic rules. Now, the rule itself, let's take a peek at this picture over here. So when you're in the back end of our question editor, and actually let me show you that in real time. So everybody should feel pretty familiar and comfortable with the cycle pages editor. So you're going to get to a cycle page. You're going to select your question, or your page rather, and then within your question, you're going to see that question editor. And it's gotten a little bit of a facelift, so we'll talk about that in a second too. But the biggest difference now is that we've got this conditional logic section. By default, it's set to no. If we change this to yes, then we start to see the elements of that conditional logic rule. So if I look back at our picture here, I'm going to break down the difference between some of these elements that you actually see on screen versus how we name them. So the rule itself is the complete set of conditional logic for your secondary question. So that's going to contain everything beneath the yes or no question. So by default, you start with a single criteria on top of your basic sort of ask, whether it's going to show or hide. And then you can also have up to 3 criteria. So if you had 1, 2, or 3 criteria, this whole set is considered your rule. Then your criteria is just that single line where we've got our primary action and value. So as I said, everything starts with that default of 1 criteria, and then you can add 2 or 3, and we'll talk about the pros and cons of that in a little bit. But by default, you're going to have 1 criteria per rule. And that's going to include your primary question. And so on this example, on my back end, I've already built all of these questions on this page. And so what's going to show up when you click this select question dropdown is all of the question types on the page that can be primaries. The only question field types that can be primaries are the text area fields and any of the optional response fields. So that's going to be any of your drop-down question, your radio button, your check mark questions, and then even text fields. But again, we'll talk about the pros and cons of using text fields. But the rest of those are all questions where you're going to create the optional response. And this makes conditional logic really clean because there's only a very specified response or set of responses that your applicants can give versus an open-ended text question. So, so remember that the primaries that are going to show up in that drop down are going to be any question on the page that's a text area field or an optional response field. Now, in this example, that's mostly all I've written, so it seems like a lot, but probably in your pages, you'd see quite a bit fewer options than this. But you will see them by that title. So that internal title that you give your question is even more important now than it's ever been before. You know, I always try to drive home the fact that that title is what shows up on this title question table, but it's also going to be the header for your columns on your reports. And it's also what your applicants see if they don't answer that question when it's required. They would see on their submit page, hey, you haven't answered multiple secondaries. Go back to that page. So it's always been important, but now more than ever, you really want to make sure that the question title makes sense to you so that when you're building your conditional logic, you see that title in this dropdown. So that's going to be that primary. Then we've got our action, and that is not, or contains. And it's the action that the rule will look to for meeting the condition. So it's always going to be these three options. And again, we'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons. And then we've got our value, which is going to be that final field right here. If you select an optional response question, so let's say it's going to be our ethnicity race question, then this field already populates with the responses that we created for that question. So just like you've always done in the past, when you've created an optional response question where you've asked a question and then you've asked the applicant to give you a single or multiple response to responses that you already created, you're going to continue to do that exactly the same. And now the benefit is you're going to see those responses here and you can tell the system to act upon those response selections. So basically, we've got our primary, our action, and our value make up our criteria. And then those along with show or hide and all or any make up the rule. And even though you can only build conditional logic to point at a primary that is a text field or an optional response field, any kind of question type can be the secondary field. So if you wanted to ask for an upload of a bio because somebody has told you that they work professionally in their artistic discipline, you can always make that upload field show up just based on them saying, yes, I'm a professional in this field. I don't do it, you know, as an amateur. But you couldn't go the opposite way and say, upload your bio. And because you've uploaded your bio, we're going to ask you a question that follows on top of that. So you're always going to see this conditional logic drop down for any question that you're creating. You're just not always going to see all of your questions in that drop down there. Any questions there with our definitions or sort of the basics of what we're seeing here? We're of course going to dive a lot deeper in. But any questions so far? Great. All right. So using conditional logic obviously is the main thing you want to understand how to do here. And so you've already seen sort of where to find this. And so let's dive into some examples of where you might see this for some of your existing applications. And I do want to specify that even though hopefully you're super excited this exists, we're really excited about it, that you don't go into any of your live applications and add this on right now. If you've already got some folks who've accessed a live cycle, it would not be great if some of them saw it pre-conditional logic and some see it after. So the best time to implement this conditional logic, even on your existing cycles, is the next time you clone and are ready to start your next season of applications, or if you're just now starting a brand new program and this feels like the right tool for that cycle. But you're going to find it, as we've already seen, in your question editor. And if you've already got a question that exists, or rather, let me take that back, you can build your page out a couple of different ways. You can certainly opt to build all of the questions on your page and then go back in and inject all of the conditional logic. So you might build out every question that's going to show up on the page and then go back in and say, okay, this one needs conditional logic and this one needs conditional logic. So I'm going to go back in after the fact, or you can sort of do it piecemeal and say, this is my primary, this is my secondary. I'm going to build those two. I'm going to build my conditional logic on the secondary, and then I'm going to go on to build my third question and maybe my fourth question. And again, sort of inject the conditional logic as you're going. You just basically need to make sure that your primary and secondary exist before you can build that conditional logic, right? So this is a page that I just built for this demo, and that's sort of the process I went through. I sort of built 1 and 2, injected my conditional logic, built 3 and 4, injected my conditional logic. So that's one way to do it. You can also, of course, go to pages that already exist. And so if this were my 2022 version of something and I've cloned it and I don't have this first page, but I've got my existing custom narrative that I've always used, I can go right to it and say, all right, I used to ask this question that was secondary phone, and maybe this isn't a great example because you would just either leave it as a not required field, but maybe you want to require a secondary phone if they have one. So maybe you want to now ask a new question that says, do you have a secondary phone? Yes or no? And that's a required question. And if they say no, you can use your existing secondary phone question and add the conditional logic to that. So if we had that, you could just as you'd imagine, head into that question editor that already existed, and then you can inject that conditional logic where it didn't exist before, and it will always, it'll work out just the same as if you had built the page anew. So let's talk about some ways that that your applicants are going to engage with this. You can build a single primary and secondary, as we've seen, which is going to look very much like if someone came to the page the very first time, you create this primary, you create these optional responses, they select one of the responses for which you've created a secondary, and now they're going to see this second question appear. So that would be pretty indicative of a question that just had a single secondary. And even though this section is called multiple secondary, sorry, I wanted to show you what that would look like. But this question happens to have multiple secondaries. So if the applicant selects children, they're going to see this question that's specific to working with kids and going to say, do you work in the school system? And then they can answer that question. If they answered adults, maybe you want a little bit more narrative about how they engage that audience. And if they answered older adults, maybe you want to ask them to upload some images of you engaging with that audience. And again, all examples, you could use all different kinds of follow-up questions. But that's an example of having a multiple secondaries built onto a single primary. And on the back end, it's going to just look like having 4 questions where the second, third, and fourth question just point to that first primary. This age range select menu is the first question, and it's just built exactly like you've always built a select menu where you've posed the question, you've added your optional responses. You do not add the conditional logic here, but then you build those 3 questions. Do you work in schools? How do you engage those adults? And then show us a picture of you with the older adults. You're going to build those 3 questions just like you always have. But in the first, do you work in the school system? And here we want to be able to tell us yes or no. We do, because maybe if they work in the school system, we want to mark them as being educators in the arts. So you'd build that just the way you always did. And here is where you'd inject your conditional logic. So by default, when I build this question, it was set to no, but now I want it to show if that age range was children under 17. So I'm basically going to select show if the question is all, and this can be all or any if you only have one. It's really moot. All or any just comes into play once you start to have multiple criteria, and we'll look at that in a bit. But for here, we're going to point to the age range question. And then by default, because we selected age range, now we're going to see those 3 options. And we want this question to show when children under 17 is selected. And so as we saw up here, that's exactly what happened. So when we selected children under 17, this question shows up. Then we built our second question, our second secondary. How do you engage this group? And again, built it just like we always would. It's a text area field. So we gave it our internal title. We gave it that label that's going to show up to applicants. We set our max characters just like we always would. We can even use required settings, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then again, we wanted this question to point to the age range question. And then we're going to say we want it to show up when adults are selected. And we've seen that happen too. And you can see that this changes in real time also. So even though the applicant hasn't, clicked save or anything at the bottom, as they go to make these changes, it happens in real time. So that's great. It doesn't sort of rely on like returning to the page and picking something new. Any questions on the way multiple secondaries work? Great. And you can also hold questions till the end too, if you'd like. Then I said, that the required setting will come into play here too. So you can use that on secondary fields and actually primary fields. So here we've got a primary field that asks about some demographics, and we can see that it's required, which just means that, like always, if the applicant doesn't respond to this question and they get to that submit page, they're going to see that notice that says, hey, you've got a question that's not responded to. But the benefit here is that if you create a secondary field, perhaps for other, that's also required, because you want to make sure that if somebody selects other, they still tell you more about how they identify. You can set this to required as well. And if they select other, but they do not fill this in, they're going to get that same required notice that they usually get on the submit page. So it works both ways, where if somebody answers this required question, but they don't get the secondary question displayed to them, that requirement isn't going to ding them, but it's also going to hold them to it if they select the response that is required. All right. You can also make secondary chains, and by that, it means that some questions can be both primaries and secondaries. So you could start a chain of questions where the second question shows up based on the answer to the first, and then a third question shows up based on the answer to the second. So maybe we're asking, what is the primary artistic discipline? And if we chose theater or music, fine, the applicant's going to move forward. But maybe we want to know more about dancers. And so if I select dance, I've created a secondary radio button question that shows up that says, when did you begin dancing? And again, if I select after 2000, maybe you don't want to know more about my dance history, but if I select prior to 2000, I'm going to have a third question, but also a secondary show up to ask for a little bit more narrative about my dance history because it's been so long. Now, I do want to show a nuance to this. If somebody selects dance and then further selects prior to 2000 and then gets here and says, you know what, I'm actually not a dancer, or I'd rather say I'm a musician because that's really where my heart is. If they come back after selecting these two and they select music, that secondary is still going to show up because unfortunately the system is holding on to that response to this question, which is the primary for this secondary. So if you set up secondary chains, you either just want to be cognizant of perhaps fielding some questions from your applicants if they see something like that, or you might even want to note the first season or two to say, hey, these are relying on conditional logic. If you answer something and then you change your answer, you might be affecting a chain of questions. Now that gets a little bit heady. You don't always want to give your applicants that kind of behind the scenes detail. So it's really just something you should be aware of. It'd be so unlikely that somebody's going to follow that path and sort of incorrectly answer here and then even incorrectly answer here and then go back and answer something differently. But just be aware that that's the way the system is going to work. All right, any questions on what we just saw there? Great. All right, so I'm going to show you some nuances to the difference between show and hide and any and all, and how that's going to affect you, and also having multiple criteria. And I chose checkboxes because it's the most likely case where you're going to have to really focus on those types of things. things. If you use the drop down or a radio button, applicants can only select one answer. And so you have a much better hold on, okay, what happens if they definitely answer dance, or they definitely answer theater, or definitely answer music. Whereas with checkboxes, they could answer a multitude of ways. And so we want to make sure that our rule is really accounting for all of the possible combinations. But you do want to just be aware of hide versus all, hide versus show, all versus any, and multiple criteria for any kind of question type that you use. But it's just, as I say, going to come into play a little bit more at the checkbox. So in this first example, we're seeing a question where they're saying the primary is, in which of the previous years have you been funded by our organization? And then we've listed the last 3 years. And the rule here on our secondary is hide if any of these match. If the years funded contains 2020, 2021, or 2022. And the way we set up our conditional logic was to assume that we want to show our secondary if the applicant has gotten funding in none of those 3 years. So in this example, which is supposed to show a not best practice, we've really sort of set ourselves up in a bad situation, because what's going to happen is, because we're saying hide until the applicant answers the question, our secondary is going to show up right out of the gate. So as soon as the applicant gets here, they're going to see this secondary question that says, tell us why you didn't get funding. Well, maybe they did get funding, but maybe they're just like reading through and they haven't answered yet. So what's going to happen here when we've said hide any, or hide if any contain these years, they're going to see this until they start to check a box. And we don't really want that. So I'd recommend not doing hide if contains. Stay away from hide if contains. Similarly, and kind of the opposite, show if is not is going to do the same thing. So where we see this example down here, it's exactly the same, even though the rule is different. We've asked our primary question, the applicant hasn't answered anything yet, and they're still seeing the secondary. And it's because we're saying, show this field if it's not any of these. So again, only until the applicant starts to check a box will that box be hidden. So again, not best practice. So you want to stay away from show is not and hide contains. Also, hide is going to give you the same problem, but is really only going to come into play if you have a single criteria. So just make sure that you don't do that sort of like cross combination. Where you're sort of using a negative and a positive, or a positive and a negative. So what would be better if we wanted to ask the same type of questions, but get to the place where only the appropriate folks see that final secondary, is we might ask the question where we're providing the possible years, and then also adding a fourth option that says none of these years, I haven't been funded in any of them. And that makes it a little bit easier for you to create a single criteria rule where you're saying, okay, perfect. If they select any of these, they're not going to see that box that talks about them not having been funded. But if they go on to select not funded in any of these years, they are going to see that box. And you can see that because we set it up as show contains versus show is, they could even mistakenly check any of these boxes as well. But as long as they have checked this box in any combination with the others, they're going to see this field that speaks to why they haven't been funded. And that matches sort of the workflow a little bit better, because now they've definitely told you they're not funded and you want to know why. So show and contains is almost always the best way to go, in my opinion. This is the best practice. If you can build your questions where you are basically saying, I just want my secondary to show if the response is X, is one of the easiest ways to make sure that you're sort of cleanly making these rules. And contains is almost always better than is, especially for a checkmark question. If you select is for a checkbox question, what we would see is that if they had selected any of these three along with this, we're sort of going against the rule, because it's not just not funded in any of these years. Now it's one of these along with not funded, and that's going to hide this box as well. So contains and show is, again, always the place where I would recommend you to be if it's possible. The rule we're seeing here is show if it contains. And this is just another kind of example of sort of what we saw above, but this is if you want to ask a totally different kind of secondary. So this was an unusual thing where we're sort of asking the negative, where we're saying, okay, you didn't respond to any of these things, so tell us why. Here, we want to say you are choosing one of these and we want to know more about it. So it's a little bit like the dance example up above. But here, if we're saying, in which of the previous years have you been funded? And we want to know more about 2020 because that was the beginning of COVID, then we've set up this to say, if the answer contains 2020, then show them our secondary, which is going to be, were you able to spend your 2020 funding or was it deferred due to COVID? And this way, even if they select the other 2 years, you're still asking this question. All right, so here we've got an example of multiple criteria coming into play and when it's best to use show or any versus all. So here we want to ask the question, where do you spend most of your funding? And for us, we really want to get to coastal funding. So even the combination of these three, we want them to tell us more about funding if they're in Los Angeles and or New York. So because we've said show if any is, we're basically telling the system, I only want to show the secondary if the answer is Los Angeles or the answer is New York. Now we'd expect right away then to see this box show up for Los Angeles. We'd expect to see it show up for New York like we did. But because we've chosen is instead of contains, choosing both Los Angeles and New York and or Denver is going to hide that secondary. And it's because the act of using is here is sort of canceling out that it could be anything else. So the best way to manage this, if you want to show a secondary based on a combination of a couple answers, is contains here, and we selected any combination of these three, but at LA or New York were at least part of that, then we'd see our secondary. So again, here we've got the same sort of idea, but all. And so here, we're really shooting ourselves in the foot a little bit because now, even if they select Seattle alone or Miami alone, we're not going to see any of the items because we're basically telling the system it's got to be Seattle and it's got to be Miami. And there's no scenario in which it can be only one or only the other. So we can see it's sort of broken here. So you definitely want to stay away from show all and is. Show any and is still limiting, again, because if they select both coasts, you're not going to ask that question. But that may be what you're after. Maybe you are trying to say your follow-up question is how do you spend your money in New York? And then that would be a fine way to do this. But then you probably would just leave the LA notice, or criteria out of your rule altogether. So then the best way to do this is really to say show all and contains or show any and contains, depending on what you're after. And so here it's kind of the same idea, just different cities. In which city or cities is your funding spent? If I choose San Francisco and Boston, I'm going to see that option. But again, that's because it's all. If it were any, then any combination, including one of these two coasts, is going to show me that follow-up. But as it stands, I have to really be sort of rigid and choose both in order to show that follow-up for any of these options. So show any contains is going to help you show that secondary when any combination is going to be what you want them to give you when they should see that secondary follow-up. So I know that's quite a bit. I can definitely put together something that I'm going to include along with this tutorial that sort of lays out exactly what we've gone through here, which sort of says, here's best practices, here are not good practices, and here's why you might be seeing what you're seeing when you put together your rule. But the biggest thing I would recommend is just take a little bit of time, 30 minutes, 60 minutes when you've got it, and get in here and just play around, because some of this is just going to be best learned when you sort of do it hands-on. I've done this, 20 times already between the testing and preparing for this. And there are still times where I think, wait, Is it show all is better or show all contains is better? So I would just recommend get in here, build a couple, and then really make use of that preview page as much as you can. And then that's going to show you exactly what your applicants are seeing as well. Now with the preview page, remember that that's not going to allow you to save, but it will allow you to absolutely see the behavior of conditional logic. So it's a fine way to do that check as you're building. And if you're not seeing it behave the way you thought it would, if you thought that, you know, selecting both of these boxes was going to show that table, that's just your indicator to go back in and try a different combination of these rules. All right, so let's talk about some nuances of using the tool altogether. So the biggest thing I really want to drive home for everybody that I think is going to be probably the one piece of this that's going to confuse things year after year is that these conditional logic rules, they do not get retained when you clone. So you will build all of your questions on a page, just like always. They're always going to be, you know, show up on that page editor. But what you'll have to do when you go to clone a cycle that you've already built conditional logic in, you'll have to go back through and recreate those conditional logic rules. So in our case here, we will see our lengthy list of all the questions, but what they'll be missing is that conditional logic that you've injected in years prior. And I'm really hoping to do some development on this, but it was a bit of a compromise we had to make if we wanted this to come out this year. So for now, just be aware that if you're cloning cycles with conditional logic, you're going to have to take those extra couple minutes when you go to clone it to just go back through and inject that conditional logic. But as I said, every single question is going to show up regardless of the conditional logic, because all these questions exist. You're just going to have to, you know, go to that question editor and then add back in your conditional logic, just like we've seen. All right, and then as I alluded to, because all the questions exist on the page, regardless of the conditional logic rules, you know, these are all of our questions. All of those questions also show up on that read-only preview. So even though maybe I've answered a question that keeps a couple of the secondary questions from displaying, those secondary questions are going to show up on that read-only preview that you and your panelists look at. So it may look like they've not responded to a question, but you and your panelists will know, well, they didn't choose a coastal city for this response because I only see Denver. And so I know why this question is not answered, because they didn't spend money on the coast. Then want to be super clear, and the system would stop you if you were trying to do this, but if you delete a primary question, it's going to break your conditional logic, obviously, because when you come in, you know, let's say that we had conditional logic looking at our radio buttons here. If I go to delete this, I'm going to get a notice that says, are you sure you want to remove this? Deleting this question will remove the conditional logic. So it's going to give you a pretty good stopgap, but in case you don't read these or you don't realize what that's going to do, clicking OK and removing that question is, of course, then going to break these follow-up questions, and they're all just going to display because now they're not pointing to this primary. And then one other little nuance that I've actually seen behave a little bit differently this morning when I went to do the review of this webinar, if you use a date field as a secondary, I just would ask you to be cautious, because as it stands right now, if you recall, our date fields look like drop downs. We are changing these to date pickers in the coming months. But for now, if a date field exists and the applicant doesn't respond to it, it basically just defaults to the top of each drop down. And so if this is a secondary that's hidden because maybe you've asked, are you a 501c3? And if they say yes, your secondary question is, when did you get your 501c3 standing? If they said no and they don't see this question, on that read-only preview, it might show 1118, even though that's not what the applicant selected. So I'd recommend until these become date widgets or date pickers, that you hesitate to use date fields as secondary questions. Okay, so here are some of the main takeaways we hope you glean from this webinar. The first is that optional response question types are really going to be the best suited as primaries for your conditional logic. Text field primaries are going to require the value to be typed by your applicants exactly as you have entered it, and that just makes them far less reliable. If you feel like you want to do it though, give it a try, do your preview, do your testing, see if it's going to be appropriate, but by and large, I think your primaries are going to be those optional response fields. Then you're going to want to make sure that you build your questions in a way that a singular response displays the secondary question. Because you're the one coming up with the questions and the possible responses, be sure to do it in a way that makes your life easier. Don't ask a convoluted question and hope that some sort of combination gives you the reason that somebody should see that secondary. Show plus contains with a single criteria is really the best way to build when possible. Show plus any plus contains is going to be best for checkbox questions with multiple criteria, where any combination of responses, including your desired response, should show that secondary. Stay away from show plus is not or hide plus is and contains. You'll need to rebuild your conditional logic when you clone a cycle. The best time to inject conditional logic is when you've cloned your existing cycles or if you're just building a brand new cycle. All the questions on your page will appear on that read-only preview. The conditional logic only applies to what applicants are seeing on their read-write form. And be sure to make use of that preview page or testing while you're building just to see your conditional logic in action. All right, so I know that is a ton coming at you. What questions can I answer, or is there anything else I can point to or go over again? Can help answer.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Just about with the knowledge base, and I'm only just seeing your screenshot right here. So do you talk about the primary and secondary question in there?
So this is the tutorial in the knowledge base. So we do get into it in the definitions, and then I try to use that language down here to say, you know, this is, you're selecting your question, which is your primary. Yeah.
I think I need to practice that a little bit.
You what?
I think I need to practice that a little bit. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. And hopefully, you know, it's the kind of thing that once you do it 2 or 3 times, it becomes a little bit more rote that like, oh, this is my, what we call primary. And that's the first question that shows up. And then, you know, this is always the secondary. And so here's how I treat that. But yeah, but great point too. This is also available in the knowledge base, just as everything is. And it's going to be found under, so under building grant applications, you're going to just find it as part of the cycle pages grouping. And so that cycle page is conditional logic. And that's what we're looking at here. Thanks, Sharon. Good question.
Hi, Jessica. Sorry, I was a little bit late, but that was a great presentation. One thing I'm thinking of is we have often it'll be like, you know, primary contact, secondary contact, or primary address and secondary address. Not to confuse those terms with your all's terms, but
I know what you mean.
And so when there's like multiple where it's like, you know, or like mailing address versus, you know, your main address, like, how would you recommend like dealing with something like that?
For sure. I might recommend then, so let's say we want all the contact information on a single page. And so we might build our main contact, you know, set where our header is perhaps main contact. And then we've got 3 or 4 or 5 short text fields where it's, you know, first name, last name, email, phone, physical address. And then I might create a second set, sort of delineated by using a new header for our 6th question that says secondary contact information. And perhaps that question is a radio button. And the question is maybe something like, do you have secondary contact information? Or, you know, whatever might be the appropriate way to phrase that. Like, is there a secondary contact at your organization who we should reach out to in the event we can't reach you or something? And then if the answer is yes to that, then maybe we create 5 additional, you know, secondary short text fields where it's secondary
Right.
person, first name, secondary person's email, what have you. And that way then all 5 of those are going to point to that, yes, primary, to show them or not. And if they say no, then they don't see any of them, right? And then they just go on to the next field. So I would say we would probably do it that way.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Good question. Anything else? And for sure, feel free, as always, if you're watching this today, you're joining us today, and you're not doing your building for your next cycle until 6 months from now, please reach out for sure. I mean, I'd love for you to look at the tutorial first if you could, but I definitely want you to feel supported in this really brand new heavy tool. So if it's a while before, you get to actually utilize what we've talked about today, for sure, please reach out and we can go over this again. Thanks so much for joining, everyone.